everyone, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and tonight we're going to have much less fun compared to last week. We're not doing anything crazy. We're back to talking about chess and chess strategy, and hopefully how you guys can improve at it. Of course, last week we had a fun class about some of the longest chess puzzles out there, but it's back to the normal stuff this week. So to start with, I've been playing a lot of just 10-minute games online on Lichess. And most of them are about the quality you would expect for a 10-minute game. But I did play one that I felt was worth going over in a class. And it actually made me think of the topic for tonight's class. So we're going to start with my 10-minute game, which inspired the topic of exploiting small weaknesses in your opponent's position. And understanding, what is a weakness in a pawn structure and how can you kind of try to exploit that. So we're going to see some obvious weaknesses in some of these games and some less obvious weaknesses, and we're going to see how you can try to sort of exploit them. So to start with, I was playing white in this position. My opponent was someone on Lichess named MapleDanish. That 2400 rating, that's just Lichess rapid rating. Don't get too excited. He's not that good. He's pretty good, but not that good. So to start with, the game went d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop e7. I played the exchange, and because of my opponent's move order, we're not going to go into the main line here, which would be bishop g5 with the knight on f6, because my opponent, I think, is trying to prevent this move for whatever reason. But white's doing totally fine here. We can just develop the bishop out to the other square. Of course, I'm trying to develop the bishop on this move because I want to play e3 to give myself this nice structure. I don't want to lock the bishop in. So bishop f4. My opponent plays c6. I play e3, all according to plan, and my opponent plays this move, bishop d6. So it might look really, really weird to go bishop e7, bishop d6. In fact, Lichess is showing a question mark, exclamation point. I'm going to turn those off. I hate those. But this is actually an opening line that's been played before. If I click over the database, Topalov has played this. Krishna has played this. It's been played a few times. The idea is, with black, we're just going to trade off some of the pieces and try and get to an equalish position. Now, in this game, I wasn't feeling too combative, so I just captured on d6. That brings my opponent's queen out, but it allows me to develop. And then my opponent plays this move, knight to e7. So this move might look a little strange to you, right? Normally, the knight comes out to f6, so let's try and understand what's going on. Why might black have played knight to e7? Yeah, Brian?
To play bishop f5?
Yeah, it's sort of keeping in line with black's plans so far. Played bishop e7 to d6 to trade off the dark squared bishops. Now, in order to not be worse, black really would like to get off the light squared bishops as well, because the light squared bishop is my quote-unquote good bishop. It's probably my best minor piece in the position because it sits comfortably behind my pawn structure. It's relatively unassailable compared to bishop on f4. And it controls these long open diagonals, puts a lot of pressure on both sides of the board. Very versatile piece. Meanwhile, this bishop on c8 is the quote-unquote bad bishop because it's on the same color as black's pawn chain. That means the pawns interfere with the bishop, and one day this bishop could be a good piece, a nice active piece, but it would also be very happy to step to f5, making use of the knight on e7 in order to trade itself off. And for those reasons, you might be able to guess white's two main moves in this position, either of them, because they're played with the idea of preventing black's plan.
Queen c2 or queen f3?
Yeah, those are actually exactly it. Queen c2 is a lot more natural. Queen f3 has also been played. In the game, I actually just developed my knight. So this should more or less give black equality here. Black gets everything he ever wanted, gets to play bishop to f5. But, I wasn't too worried about it. It's a 10-minute game online. I just wanted to play chess. So bishop f5. But for those of you at home, queen c2 and queen f3 are just objectively better moves. Why not prevent bishop f5? And in fact, after queen c2, black oftentimes will play g6, really trying to force this idea through. But in the game, just knight g to e2, we get bishop f5, and I go ahead and castle. My opponent takes the bishops off, and then really committing to this plan, plays queen to g6. And this is sort of a step too far, in my opinion. So black has really already succeeded in getting everything he wants here. He got both bishops off the board. I no longer have the superior minor piece. And if black just, for example, castles or develops knight d7 or something, there's really no reason why white should be better here. You know, it's just that it's a Carlsbad structure. Both sides get developed, and it's a chess game. But instead, after queen to g6, I think white is able to apply a little bit of pressure. So I'm curious if you guys can come up with the plan that I came up with to sort of punish black for not developing quickly enough. It's not the most usual way you would punish a lack of development, but it's pretty effective. Okay, the chat has the more conventional idea for trying to punish a lack of development. They are talking about the move e4, which I'm actually not such a big fan of here.
Maybe knight to f4? That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, okay, so knight to f4 is pretty interesting, actually. It allows queen takes queen, but then that does a lot to reroute your knight to a better square, where it's going to be eyeing the c5 and e5 squares. And yeah, I like this idea a lot more than e4, actually, but I think that I came up with the best move in the game, which is not knight f4. Knight f4 probably maintains an advantage, but I had a very, very concrete idea. I saw that if I play with the most tempo, the fastest, then I can get a really, really desirable plan to work right away. And now I'm at the point where I've given so many hints that you sort of get lost thinking about the hints and not the position. So I'll shut up, give you a minute to think about it, and then I'll tell you what I did. But yeah, knight f4, probably a very good move. All right, any last second ideas? Okay, well, we'll show it. So I actually traded the queens, which is sort of the antithesis of what you're supposed to do to punish a lack of development. But the reason is very concrete. The reason why I like this over knight f4 is because knight f4, in a sense, it's gaining time because you get to move your knight to d3 essentially for free from e2. But in a sense, it's losing time because now black does get this extra turn to develop. On the other hand, if we just take on g6 ourselves, it's true that this knight could take back on g6, but this knight actually really doesn't want to be here because our pawn structure works very well against it. It's not really advancing anywhere. Or black can take back with the pawn, which, of course, as any beginner will tell you, doubled pawns are bad, and we'll look at that in a little bit. But more importantly than that, that gives us an extra tempo in the position. Now we can do whatever we want. And maybe we have a more useful move here, the knight e2 to d3, which is essentially what knight f4 would be doing. So now that I've given you takes on g6, why was this tempo so important? And you might be surprised by the evaluation here. Once again, the idea is we're playing against black's undeveloped pieces. Allows us to get a pretty big advantage. All right, the chat is on the money here. And let me, because the chat already has it, let me ask you in a different way. What's the normal plan in this pawn structure? We've got the Carlsbad. Everybody loves the Carlsbad. You just do the minority attack. You just play b4. And it's especially powerful here because black really is just going to have to allow this right away. For example, if you try like a6 and castles or knight d7, you're sort of a turn too slow, right? You're sort of a turn too slow to do anything to stop me. You can't really play c5. The d5 pawn falls because your rooks can't get to the center quickly enough. And opening the a file, which is sort of supposed to be, quote unquote, the way black can be okay here sometimes. Well, white's already on the a file, and you've still got some work to do before you can contest me effectively. And so b4 just turns out to be really, really good here. And if I cheat for a moment and turn on the engine, black should play a6, but I'm already plus 0.5, which is definitely not nothing. My opponent plays knight d7 instead, which gives him a chance to transpose if I play a4. But there's really no need to play a4 here. I just go b5 right away. My opponent plays knight b6, kind of a weird move, but he's heading for the c4 square. And I just take on c6, take on c6. So now white is definitely going to have an edge here. Number one, we have this horribly weak c6 pawn, and it doesn't really show many signs of getting to the c5 square. And number two, we are still ahead a little bit on time. We still have a move or two before black gets fully castled and organized to sort of advance our plans. So this is the structure that we're going to have essentially for the rest of the game. And so I want to talk now about the weaknesses in the structure. I'm sure you guys can tell me, the biggest weakness here for black. Go ahead, shout it out.
Yeah, c6 pawn.
Yeah, the c6 and also c5, of course. The square in front of the backward pawn is always weak as well. But what else is weak in this position? Not necessarily just pawns, but squares as well. Because I said we were going to return to this idea of the doubled pawns being weak, right? Ask any beginner, should never have doubled pawns. But this is a really common structure. You see it a lot at high levels of play. People really aren't afraid of taking on g6 with an h-pawn. Doesn't seem to make too many weaknesses. And in fact, I would go as far as to say most people don't even understand why it could be worse to have this pawn on g6 than a square like h6 or h5. So over on this side of the board, taking on g6 with the h-pawn actually does create a weakness or two that black is going to have to look out for. And yeah, the chat has it again. The chat has it again. Any ideas first?
So you're asking for weak squares?
Yeah, weak squares or pawns or...
Well, I'm thinking e5 is weak for black, and if they want to play, if they want to contest it, it would create more weaknesses over there.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. e5 is one of the squares that h takes g sort of ironically weakens, sort of indirectly. The more direct square that weakens is, of course, g5, because h7, h6 is no longer available. So how does h7 takes g6 weaken the e5 square? Well, black would want to contest this square by playing something like f6, but f6 would now always give up, the g6 square as well, and now the g6 pawn would be weak. So e5, g5, c5, all sort of weaknesses in black's camp. And you can say that c6 is like a major weakness, but the e5 and c5, or the e5 and g5 squares, they seem sort of less, like game-changing. Like, sure, okay, the g5 square is weak, but how is that going to change the game? But I just want you to be, cognizant of those squares sort of existing, because they are going to become really, really important in a little bit here. So I start with rook f to c1. It just makes sense to put the rooks opposite the weak pawn, make sure that pawn doesn't get to c5. My opponent plays king to d7 instead of castles now. I play this move a4, which is actually a pretty bad move because it makes weaknesses in my own camp, basically. So a4, first of all, makes this pawn weaker than if it were sitting on a2. And it also weakens, most importantly, the b4 square a little bit. So not my best move. My idea was that my opponent would likely play a5 to stop my pawn from gaining too much space. Then maybe I could make use of those weaknesses myself. But not my favorite move that I've ever played. I think better would just be to continue. Yeah, what's your idea, Brian?
Oh, no, I was just wondering how they're going to use B4.
Well, stay tuned.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
Sorry.
Now I play knight f4, which is the move I probably should have just started with. And your idea from earlier is still totally correct. We want this knight on d3. We want to be able to target these weak squares in the enemy camp. My opponent plays knight to c4. I bring the knight to d3. And then here we go, rook fb8. And this is what my opponent has in mind. And obviously, d3 is not the square I want my knight to end the game on by any means. So if it has to babysit the b4 square, I'm not entirely happy. So now let's see if you guys can come up with an interesting idea here to really improve white's position. It's a few moves long, but it is something you might not expect. So let's see what you guys got. The chat is also pointing out, are we going with the principle of two weaknesses? And maybe that will be a factor in this game as well. We've got big weakness on the queen side, and then we need to see if we can turn something over here into a weakness. We can stretch the black forces thin and make it a fight. All right, the chat is going with active ideas as always. And we'll talk about those chat's ideas. We'll talk about them. Someone in the chat wants to play the move knight to e2, which is definitely not the first move that comes to mind. But I think what he's saying is he wants to bring in this knight for backup as well. That's certainly interesting. And of course the chat is still talking about this move e4, trying to advance in the center, fight for the c4 square somehow. Also a very important idea here. But I chose none of those moves.
Does it involve maneuvering your c3 knight? I feel like it could be somewhere else.
Yeah, so that's a good question to start asking yourself. You know, this knight, it seems sort of destined for the c5 square. Maybe one day it'll jump to e5, but right now I don't really want to allow knight takes e5. So the question is, you know, what is this knight doing on c3? And no, not quite as high level as knight b1, Ben Feingold joke, but it is a pretty interesting maneuvering idea with this knight that I wanted to enact here. And yeah, we'll talk about e4, be patient, but I want to show this idea first, because e4 is a little bit less clear what's going on.
So it doesn't start with knight e2?
No, so knight e2 is maybe a fine move, but if you give black a lot of time here, like rook b, okay, well rook b3 would be a pretty big mistake. But if you give black a lot of time here, maybe he's going to do some work to improve his structure over here on the king's side. Maybe stuff like g5, f6, and then all of a sudden, once those pawns sort of get organized, they're a lot harder to attack. You know, the light squares, this knight sort of slots nicely into, and it would get tough. So g5 and f6 is sort of the threat here.
Well, I was thinking maybe like h4, and then I feel like the maneuver of the knight on c3 to f4 makes a bit more sense.
Yeah.
It can never be kicked away with g5.
Yeah, I really like this move h4, and it does show up later in the game. But I wanted you guys to put on your tactic hats for a second. So I started with knight c5, and then my big idea here was that king d6 seemed like the most natural move, and then I had this idea of playing knight to e4 check. And the point is, we can get to this g5 square very, very quickly, like this. And so this was my big idea. It turns out, tactically, that black is actually doing okay after d takes e. But that's not very clear at all. To my mind, by the way, f5, the only move here to defend the pawn. In my mind, I was seeing this position in this rapid game, and I thought that I could get some stuff rolling with something like f3. But it turns out black is actually doing okay after some surprising moves here like f4. And things get really crazy here. But black is doing okay. So my idea turns out not to be the best idea in the position. e4, I think, is still a little bit early. But no, e4 is actually the single best idea. And you guys, I think we're pretty on point with everything that you were saying. You want to take on d5, you want to take on c4. I was thinking that I would play e4 in this position, even as well. Here, apparently, it's less good because of knight d2. So the chat just showing me up e4 in this position was the perfect timing. Instead, I do this knight e4 idea. But I want to claim one up on the chat here. If not for d takes e4, this is the best line for white. And I didn't think d takes e4 was really going to be working for black. It just turns out that it did. And that's the problem with 10-minute chess. You don't have time to calculate anything. But yeah, e4, very strong idea by the chat as well. The same sort of stuff. You want to shake up this knight. You want to get at the weaknesses, and you want this knight to have access into the game, whether it's through e4 or through d5. It's all about improving your worst piece. So in the game, we go for this. My opponent does not call my bluff, plays king to c7, and now we just plant this knight on the g5 square. And it's really, really tough here for black to do anything. You've got this horribly weak pawn on f7, which, again, you might not have expected to be the biggest weakness for black to deal with here. But you certainly don't want to play f6. You certainly don't want to play f5, because then you're faced with knight to e6. And that is not the change in structure that's going to save your pawns. So black's already in a very, very difficult spot here. I think the computer gives it something like +1, because now you just have too many weaknesses. And this is the idea that made me want to show off this game, because you really don't expect when you play h takes g that there's going to be a knight on g5 that you just can't kick away. And that's what we have here. So wanted to highlight that this pawn structure does actually come with deficits. They might not be immediately obvious, and they might not show up in the games very often, but they certainly can show up, and it's something to be aware of. So this is the small weakness in the position that I was hoping you guys could exploit. In the game, black played knight back to d6. It's the only reasonable way, really, to defend this pawn. And now I double up the rooks on the c file. Perfectly natural. And then we're going to bring in your idea from earlier. h4 is very certainly a very strong move in this position. We just further want to lock down this square, keep these doubled pawns right where they're at, because that's where they're going to be the weakest, not allow the opponent to play something like f6, g5 at any moment in this game. By the way, not a bad idea to have this pawn on h4, because it gets the pawn a little bit closer to queening, which might turn out to be relevant. My opponent plays king to b6. He's doing some weird maneuvering over here, but it's with the idea of eventually freeing up this knight to come back to c4. I think that's what's going on. I continue with the move g4 now. We sort of have all of our pieces really well placed, so I set about going to gain more space here on the king side, maybe improve my king, and I was just going to take my time, wait for the right moment to activate. My opponent plays knight to g8, which is a little bit weird, but maybe the knight is coming this way. And then I continue playing slow. It turns out the idea I played in the game could have been played a move earlier, but I go king g2 instead. Now knight to c4. And now white to move again. Let's see if you can find the idea that finally is going to open things up for us. Finally, it is time to get our pieces fully active. We did a great job of locking down the weaknesses. We have full control over the square in front of the c6 pawn. This pawn on f7 also not gonna be going anywhere. Our knight very well placed But how can we get our rooks active?
And now is the time for e4.
Okay, e4 once again, but now e4 is actually going to be a little bit more dangerous than it was before, I think, because don't forget this rook has landed on the b4 square. And, okay, it's very easy to blunder something here, so forgive me if I am, but let's say knight to, I don't know, either d6 or a3. Let's say d6. You could take, obviously, but let's say e5. And yeah, I'll give you knight to b7 as well. Okay, no, I'm playing awfully. All right, I gotta cheat. I can't do it. I can't play off the cuff like this. Apparently knight f6 is the best here. And okay, white is still doing very well. White is still doing very well. So e4, always a good move. You guys are right. E4 is good, but it's not what I played in the game. Not what I played in the game. And I think what I did in the game maybe is a little bit clearer. It's, again, going to be another tactical idea. Oh god, now there's a poll in the chat and I can't see anymore. Oh, okay, it moved. Subakara says if knight d6, knight d3 in that line. Okay, knight d6 was bad, but against knight d3, I'm hoping there's still at least rook c4. I'm hoping I didn't miss that much. Okay, knight g to e4 is also a very good move. The move that I tried is knight to d3. But yeah, once again, we can actually use this idea of the e4 square once again to activate along the c-file and force some real weaknesses. f5, not going to be saving the day anymore, partially because we have this pawn on g4 that can capture, but also because our king is going to get very, very active. But knight d3 is what I played instead. And let's see what the point is. So the point is, if you save the rook, I come in with rook to b1 check. This loses to checkmate, not great. King to c7 allows knight takes on f7. And then all of a sudden, the knights are sort of swarming in, and we have access on the b file, and have access on the c file after knight to e5. And these pawns are now doubled and isolated, and white is just totally killing it here. In the game, my opponent decided it was best just to give up the exchange with f6. He could have put on a lot better resistance with something like knight to f6, king to g3, and then taking on a4, but instead, just f6. I get to take on b4, takes back, I bring the knight in, rook takes on a4, I play rook to b1, blundering a fork with knight a3, but there's actually a number of ways to end the game here. Rook to a2 was the simplest. I missed it and played knight to c5 in the rapid game. Now if the rook moves, I take with check. So we simplified into this endgame, which is not entirely worth talking about, I think. Notably, the king can't ever really advance here. I just have rook b3. And so black is pretty much dead. We play some moves. I eventually come take this pawn, and take this other pawn, and take this other pawn, and black resigns. So once the rook came off the board like that, the game was pretty much over. But your guys' ideas were all very good as well, which was after knight c4, e4, I think does do a very good job of maintaining the advantage. You have to be careful of these moves, though. And knight g to e4, I think, is just the objectively best move. You're coming back with the knight, you're getting rid of the knight on c4, and you have successfully clamped down all of these pawns on the king's side. So what are the important parts of this game? There's a few things. Number one is just understanding that even though material is totally equal here, and maybe black thinks he has the c6 weakness managed with this knight coming to c4, white is going to have a pretty big advantage, an even bigger practical advantage in positions like these. Number two, take note when there's a deficit in the pawn structure, when there's a defect somewhere, because it does make these squares like g5 and e5 just a little bit softer. And it's important not to allow, not to play things like knight e2 here, I think, because knight e2, again, something like g5, and hopefully I'm not blundering anything yet. I don't think I am. Yeah, something like g5 and f6, and then the squares become a lot harder to access, and maybe black can put up a lot more resistance. Okay, so questions on this game. I know it was a 10-minute rapid game, and we just spent half an hour analyzing it, but I do think the positions were pretty interesting. So any questions here? Nothing for me? All right. Fair enough. Let's move on then to some better chess players, namely Tigran Petrosian. Once again, the world champion, not the cheater. Always have to specify. Against Henrique Mecking, who is not a player I know very much about, but I know he's been on the bad end of a few very famous games, this being one of them. So let's go over this game and see how Petrosian is able to make use of some weaknesses. So d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6. We end up in this normal-looking Torre. Knight b to d2 takes on d4, which is, I guess, the start of the deviation from modern-day theory. Not that the theory in the Torre is all that important. And we get h6. H6 pushing this bishop back. And so already, h6, usually a desirable move for black in many instances, but does come with some weaknesses, namely the light squares. Always going to be a little bit weak. We get bishop back to f4, knight h5, bishop back to e3, knight f6, and then bam, knight e5. And all of a sudden, we get a big change in structure. Takes on e5, and knight d7, and bishop to d4. So I think this is the first moment. Well, actually, let's go a couple moves further because we play another couple forcing moves. Let's pause here. So knight c5, we move the bishop. Black plays a5. So let's try and assess what's going on in this position. So first of all, what sort of deficits in the black structure can you start to pick out already? What is Petrosian trying to target in this structure? b5 and b6, okay. We'll get the full list. I'm not counting those squares out just yet. James Duggan says maybe the g6 square. Just had to check my move count there. Ricardo says g7 even. Just go after the pawn somehow. So I'm sort of asking you this question to move early. So right now, yes, there are some weaknesses, right? The pawn has been pushed to h6. This pawn has been pushed to e6. That sort of softens up these two squares. But, I mean, what's the big deal, right? It's not like our f7 and g7 pawns are going anywhere. And on the queen's side, yes, a5 might make some weaknesses here, but this is sort of a red herring because in structures like this, the queen side is normally where black is trying to play. So it looks like these squares are weak, but I mean, black is trying to play like b5, b4 later this game. And so that's where black is trying to open things up. So yeah, it's relevant that these squares could be weak. Maybe one day a4 is a good idea to lock things down over here. But it's not going to be the most relevant yet. But the big trick here is that Petrosian has a really nice idea that's going to clarify the weaknesses a lot more in just a move or two. Puts black in a really difficult spot. So right now, some minor weaknesses, but nothing to write home about. But Petrosian is aiming to provoke bigger weaknesses. Yeah, f4, f5. So that's going to be a really common plan in these positions. But that's more just attacking the structure that you currently have. Petrosian finds a nice idea that forces black to weaken the structure even further before going after it. But f4, f5 is a perfectly normal plan, and yeah, you would want to castle and then continue f4, f5. So I'm not going to say you're wrong. Yeah, the chat says h4, and then the chat also says in those days they didn't play h4. Not necessarily true, but in this case, a pawn is a pawn is a pawn, and black is going to take it.
Queen g4?
Yeah, queen g4 is actually really nice here for white. And the point is, there's no comfortable way to defend this, and in fact, there's so much not a comfortable way to defend this that black is almost obliged to just move this pawn forward. And that's what happens in the game, just g6. And this is obviously not great. In fact, Petrosian, I think more or less has a winning position already, because this g-pawn just doesn't belong here on g6. So now hopefully it's really apparent what's going to be weak. It's going to be these dark squares, right? These dark squares and also these light squares. Like just every square over here on the king side is going to be a weakness that Petrosian is going to try to target. So let's see how Petrosian continued. So now the chat is probably feeling a lot better about their h4 idea, but I still think it might be a little bit premature, because something like h5 is going to give black a lot of time and sort of shut you down. Not that white is ever really in danger here or anything. So instead, Petrosian just castles now. We get bishop out to d7, rook f to e1, queen to c7, and then Brian's idea is actually going to come through, meaning we want to target these squares somehow. So I sort of spoiled this already, but black, especially after queen c7, looking to get something going on the queen side. And this is sort of pretty typical when you have big weaknesses around your king side. You want to open things up somewhere way on the other side of the board, try and distract your opponent from the glaring weaknesses on the other side and use that as counterplay. So I spoiled it a little bit, but the move that's going to stop b5, b4 and lock the action down on the queen side is, of course, this move a4. And that's what Petrosian plays in the game. So I said b6, b5, not super relevant weaknesses, but they're relevant because we can sort of slow down black's plan. We're not really aiming to occupy these necessarily, but we can definitely slow black down. Black plays knight a6 in the game. We get queen to e2. And now king to f8 is Mecking's choice. Probably mispronouncing his name horribly. I should look these things up. Knight f3 by Petrosian. And now, again, I want to ask you to try and find Petrosian's idea here. It's going to be a lot harder than any ideas I came up with in my games. But let's see if you can come up with a more long-term plan to go after some of these dark squares. There was a question in the chat, why didn't castle protect the g-pawn? It did, but you might get checkmated, I think. That's the danger, is checkmate there. I'll have to look at the exact position, actually. Let me figure out where we were.
Just in general, I felt I would be happy if black castled after I played queen g4.
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely you're happy if black castle's there. Yeah, I can't give you the exact refutation off the cuff here, but castle's not a good idea. Okay, everybody still wants to play h4. It's definitely worth thinking about. Subakura says h4 followed by h5. Well, that is optimistic. Don't know if black is letting you play h5. Try and think about where you want to put your pieces. Yeah, what do you think, Brian?
I have a slow guess. H3, knight H2, knight G4 to go up to F6, and then if they play H5, then we just come back and try to go to G5 instead.
Yeah, so you're along the right track there. Like, this is more common, I think, in that other opening that's is somewhat popular. I think it's called E4 E5. This idea shows up in those openings a lot, but here we actually have a faster way to force this pawn to H5, and I think it's what the chat was saying. H4 eventually is probably going to be enticement enough to get our opponent to play something like H5 or some other weakening move. But Petrosian actually doesn't do it immediately. But H4, of course, very, very important idea here, and we are going to see it eventually in this game. Oh my god, and we have Henrique Mecking trivia in the chat now. This is fun, I'll guess.
You can say Henrique Mecking in the chat. There he is.
Fortunately, no, he's not joining us tonight.
Do we want to move the bishop to E3 to D2 maybe?
Why do you want to do that?
Like our eventual goal is to contest G5 after they play H5, and I want to move it back to not lose the E pawn.
Okay, that makes sense. So this bishop E3 idea is actually what Petrosian plays in the game, and I'm a big fan. But let's try to understand what's going on here. So this might look like a really, really weird move. Our bishop's sort of tucked in quite nicely in our pawn structure there. But bishop E3, I think, is an important idea here. And I wanted to highlight how important this is to Petrosian's attacking sort of scheme here. So you might be familiar in positions where we have a fee encaded bishop with the king on G8, the bishop on G7, just like a normal position. You might be familiar with the idea that white often tries to trade off that bishop in order to attack the king. And most players would be able to tell you, yes, of course, we want to trade off that bishop because G6 has weakened black's dark squares. And that is true. It's all true. But it turns out it's true in other positions as well. So this bishop is doing a lot of the legwork here to keep these dark squares under control. So by removing our bishop from D4, we're aiming to eventually put this bishop on G5 and say to black, you're not going to be able to keep that bishop forever. If I can trade that off, I'll be able to access these dark squares a lot more easily and attack your king a lot more easily. So I think that's the critical point here behind bishop E3 and why Petrosian chooses this move. But once again, the chat isn't far off. H4, of course, is going to be an important idea. So bishop E3, we get knight C5, and then Petrosian actually plays this move, knight to D4. So good square for the knight. We're sort of pretending we might go to B5.
Sorry, tactically we can't. They can't take B5.
Yeah, we're preventing B5 for black, and as Brian just pointed out, this is still no good. Still no good for black. So knight to D4, and of course, what's the other idea behind moving the knight? It's so that the knight's not on F3, so that we can push with F4. Once again, this F4 idea certainly going to be relevant here as well. So knight to D4, our opponent plays rook to A6. I believe Petrosian just keeps it simple, plays bishop back to C1. I don't think we had to do this immediately. We could have relied on this tactic, but might as well just keep it solid. And of course, the super strong rook A6, rook to A8 maneuver. Unfortunately for black, it's tough to do anything here. This move A4, taking advantage of this slightly less important weakness on the queen side, turns out to be really relevant. It's really hard to play B5 here or get anything going on the queen side. Now Petrosian goes with G3, and finally the chat can scream it now. What's the move here? H4, of course. Look at those nice bishops angling at the king, our queen even on the third diagonal. It's time to push the H pawn. And black, of course, is not going to let us get to H5, because as ugly as these dark squares look, if you pass, these light squares are going to look even uglier. And this is also going to be a hook, of course. And so how could white potentially make use of this pawn on g5? What could we do?
Play f4 at some point.
Yeah, at some point f4 is going to come, and we have very easy access to the black king. We're going to open some files, going to be able to attack. Now, maybe not right away. We're not playing f4, but eventually this pawn being a hook is going to be really annoying. So h5 instead. Now, Petrosian continues taking his time, goes with queen f3 first, bishop to d2, and now the key move that I was sort of talking about earlier. How is Petrosian going to continue to pressure the dark squares? How does he keep up the pressure? Yes, bishop g5. It's the perfect time now. Once again, this bishop doing all the defensive work over here, and Petrosian simply takes it off the board. We get queen to d8, and Petrosian now just defends the bishop. And why do you think Petrosian opts to defend the bishop rather than just trade with bishop e7? What do you think the difference is? He's got something sneaky in mind.
Does he want the pawn on g5?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So 2 more moves were played, but now we get to see his point, bishop g5. He wants to take this back with the pawn. And yeah, Petrosian's just being really, really mean about it. He's saying your dark squares are so weak, and now he's going to use both of these pawns to really permanently keep those squares weak. And we'll see that he's going to take this idea even one step further. So rook to a8 was played, and then Petrosian actually comes all the way in with queen to f6. So Mecking is still sort of just passing on the other side. And so you might expect Petrosian to play, something like rook f3, try and checkmate black, but he's actually happy to just come in with queen f6. And then the next move may shock you. It may even terrify you. Queen takes f6, and then believe it or not g takes f6, but e takes f6. So what's going on here? What is Petrosian thinking? Just trading the queens against the opponent's weak king and taking back, giving ourselves doubled pawns. What is the point of it all? What's going on here?
Well, first of all, the light square bishop is now hitting the g6 pawn, so he could potentially put a rook on h1.
Okay.
Try and get at the king that way. Alternatively, I immediately saw that he's got knight f3 heading to e5 now.
Yeah.
Free up the e5 square for his knight. And once the knight gets there, it's going to be very strong.
All right, so some good points there. I don't know how important this pin is going to be. By the time we get our guys over to h1, black is probably going to be ready to play king g8. But Petrosian actually does start with king g2, maybe angling to force king g8 and keep this rook sort of entombed. But here we're going to see that he goes for something else. So your idea was to go knight f3 to e5 immediately. That might be okay. But first, Petrosian does something to lock it down even further, which is just put this pawn onto f4. And now that things start to become a little bit more clarified, we can kind of see that Petrosian's advantage is not slipping at all. In fact, it's just sort of getting even stronger. Rather than have this pressure on the king side, now we've given ourselves full control over all of the dark squares in the center of the board, all of the dark squares on black's king side. And using these dark squares, our knight is really going to be able to attack all of the light squares in black's camp as well. So f4, another really cool move. And now Petrosian takes his time with it. He does bring this rook to h1, drop this king back to g8, and now finally knight f3 and knight e5, as we said. We get bishop e8, bishop d3, just improving this piece. Rook to c8, king to f3, bishop c6, rook to h2, bishop back to e8. No real discoveries there. I think white would be happy to take an extra pawn. King to e3, rook to c7, king to d4, knight to b7, and okay. Now no more free moves. So what did Petrosian do over the last 5-10 moves? I sort of skipped past them. All he was doing is understanding that he has a total lock on this position. These two pieces aren't going anywhere. We control every square in the black camp here, so no way to get these pieces out. And Petrosian realized black can't do anything useful, so what he did is he brought his king to the center to improve that piece, brought his knight to the ideal square, brought his bishop to the ideal square, and now it's time to go. So finally, let's try and crack things open now that we have full control and have improved our pieces to the maximum. Yeah, b4 is great. It also plays against this knight c5 idea that black was aiming for. So b4 to start. Black just plays knight back to d8. Now again, we see some funny business with Petrosian moving the rooks. Black continues passing. And then he actually comes through with b5. And the point now is that even this bishop has now been essentially immobilized. By the way, if it gets too far away, keep in mind that these two pawns might become queens with some sacrificial ideas. Knight c5 played in the game, bishop c2, knight to d7, rook a3, knight c5, and then of course what is the follow-up idea to break things open? How do we actually crack it open now that we have gained even more space on the queen side? Nishis in the chat says this is the worst black bishop to ever live. I would argue that the rook is the worst rook to ever live. I would rather be this bishop than this rook. It's tough. All right, there's really only one break left here. Well, I guess two, but one that white was really aiming for. Yeah, just c4. Just finally opening things up over here. Black plays knight back to d7. Petrosian just brings the rook to c3. Not afraid of trades at all because, again, this rook takes longer to get in the game than white's rook does, for sure. Take on e5, and continuing to move the king in. We're not really worried about taking this pawn back either. Just continuing to improve here. Rook to c8. And then because Petrosian is so mean, he decides to win with his king. Plays king to d6. I think everything is winning here. Bring the rook in, but he brings the king in as well. Rook c to c1, h4, and then Mecking had enough after h4 and resigned the game. Of course, king to e7 essentially is winning a bishop, as well as take and then king e7, or rook c4 and then king e7, or rook c4 and then rook c8. Everything is winning here. And you might not expect it to be as dire as it is from this position. But actually here, it's already like +3. And that's how bad it is with all these dark squared weaknesses. But I really love this game from Petrosian because it shows you how he turns, just a little bit of softness in the black camp, a little bit of weakness over here, a little bit of weakness over here. But then all of a sudden after queen to g4, g6, position just becomes unsalvageable. The weaknesses keep compounding. He maneuvers this bishop back to e3 with this idea that after h4, which was always going to come, it can come out to g5 and increase this dark squared control even more. And then finally this queen f6 idea with f4 to follow. And then all of a sudden, just every dark square on the black king side and in the center now belongs to white. And with that, he had all the time in the world to bring his king in, all the time in the world to play b4, b5, play c4. Really anything you wanted to do at that point was just going to be totally winning. Improves his position to the maximum, and then the hammer comes down. Okay, so this game was a little bit higher level than the first game I showed tonight, But hopefully the ideas are still sort of making sense here. Petrosian just needling at these weaknesses until they become worse and worse and worse, and then eventually, the position just sort of wins itself. You can do anything and win the game. So questions on this game before we sort of wrap up here? No questions at all?
Yeah, can I see the refutation for instead of playing G6 castles?
Oh yeah, okay, castles instead of G6. This is a good one. I forgot about this. So let's castle. And I'll try to do it by myself before we turn on any helpers here. I imagine there are a lot of things that win. I'm wondering if just the simple bishop e3 is already just sort of smashing. I will play the more respectable move first, though, which is something like h4. Now you sort of desperately want to play f6, but I think that runs into stuff like queen g6 here. So I don't know. It's hard to play a move with black, really. Let's say you develop. My idea is just to go rook h3, rook g3, and I don't know if you're getting off the ground here. Like rook g8, knight f3, knight g5 next, queen f8 maybe. I still come here. Like it starts to look pretty ugly. So that's my attempts. I don't know how accurate that was. Let's go ahead and ask the engine overlords. The engine overlords do like h4. And wow, okay, I'm playing perfectly so far. I'm continuing to play all the best moves. Okay, rook g3, rook g8 is fine. Knight f3 is the best. Queen f8 is the best. Okay, who was I kidding? I know everything about chess. So not quite a total refutation here, but black is definitely in for a very, very tough game. White can castle this way. The counterplay is not coming so quickly, and it's just going to be really, really tough. Well, I was surprised at how close to the engine line I was there, but that's it. We just activate our pieces, attack the black king, and it's going to be really tough. Queen h5 is coming. That's why the computer's saying g6 is a must. Like if you play b5, I think queen h5. No, never mind. My good luck streak ends. Queen f4, though, is going to be the tough move here. And if bishop e8, ooh, knight h7 is rough, and yeah, not a fun position. Not a fun position, especially for playing g6. When again, you might as well play the way black played in the game if you're playing g6 here anyways. So there you go. Was that satisfying enough, everybody? Did that look painful enough for black? I hope so. All right, any other questions? All right. Well, in that case, I think that is just about my time. We do have the wonderful Grandmaster Alex Shabalov. I think this is his last YouTube lecture, so be sure you guys stick around for it. It's been a pleasure having the big two-time US champion, three-time? Does Ben know off the top of his head? Nobody knows. Multi-time US champion Alex Shabalov. It's been great having him here as GM and Rez, and I've been enjoying his lectures, so make sure you guys stick around for it. All right, with that, as always, my name is Caleb Denby. I want to thank you all very much for coming out and watching. This has been The Road to 2000, and I will see you next time.